I'm going to start with a teaching from Chogyam Trungpa, who's a quite controversial Tibetan Buddhist teacher. And he said this: according to the Buddhist tradition, we don't get new wisdom through awakening bodhicitta, unconditional compassion, nor does any foreign element come into our state of mind at all. Rather, it is a question of waking up and shedding our covers. Conventionality refers to belief in habitual patterns. We are intrinsically Buddha and intrinsically good. In other words, you don't need to become wise. This is very provocative, isn't it? Because we're always rushing around trying to improve ourselves. You don't need to become wise, but you need to set aside what is blocking your wisdom. And I guess that's life, isn't it? We come up against things and we realize, if we're lucky, that something is blocking our wisdom, and we move on. You know, I love this teaching for several reasons, and the less important one is Trungpa's strike against conventionality. Of course, I love that, because the habitual patterns that affirm conventionality feel cozy, they may even feel natural, they may even feel like this is the way to do things. Does that all sound pretty familiar? But they can also be a straitjacket, and they can certainly be a mask on the eyes, preventing us from waking up. We need to interrogate what feels most comfortable, because it might in fact be preventing us from waking up. But the second reason that I really love this teaching is the profound reminder that it brings, as I've often tried to bring here too, that you are intrinsically good, and that you are intrinsically resourced. You have what you need. You don't always need to seek it from outside yourself. From outside yourself, we often need to seek inspiration or confirmation or encouragement or appreciation or love or joyfulness or radiance. But we also need to discover that those jewels are within us. Those jewels are within us. So what we have as a possibility is to liberate ourselves from whatever is deluding us, clouding the mind, or holding us back. This could be our own thoughts. It could be our view of ourselves and our world, and I talked a lot about view last month. It could also be habits that we believe are absolutely necessary for our survival, but that are keeping us either small or restricted or even mean-minded, and not allowing us to emerge from the chrysalis to become whatever we can be. In a few moments, I'm going to share with you why this teaching has been so important for me in the last few days. But before I do that, I want to share two more quite exquisite insights that really came to me very powerfully. The first of these is going to feel familiar to you. So I want you to actually exercise in this moment, giving up an habitual pattern of mind so that you can hear these words as if they were being spoken for the very first time. So, this is from a letter to some very ordinary people in Corinth who were very much like us, longing to understand how they could live a little bit better. Isn't that why we're here? We want to know how we can live a little bit better, how we can love a little bit less, with fewer conditions and a little less restricted. How we can forgive more honestly and deeply. So here are Paul's words. If I speak with the tongues of people or of angels, but do not have love, I am merely a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gifts of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and have faith enough to move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own and surrender my body to hardship, but do not have love, I would gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or proud. Love does not dishonor others. It is not easily angry or resentful. It takes no pleasure in doing wrong. It rejoices in truth. And now, this is the passage that I want you, with a couple of lines, I want you to hear now through your hearts, not just through your minds. Love bears all things. Love believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and love never ends. I don't think those lines could be any plainer, do you? None of our efforts count or can bring any kind of hope to ourselves or one another unless they are cradled, surrendered to, imbued by love, unless we bring heart to them as well as mind, unless we allow them to travel through our heart, to arise through the heart, and be delivered through mind and mindful action. In other words, all of our cleverness, all of our strategic thinking, all of our self-justifying, all of our habitual thinking needs to take second place to the profound and unlimited wisdom of learning life through the heart, which of course is not easy because it arouses immediately a sense of vulnerability. If we open our hearts too widely, how could we bear the pain of the world's suffering, never mind our own? I think the other difficulty with it is that although we may believe it, or we may think it's relatively easy, we don't always believe it at the time we most need it. In other words, we're more inclined to think, oh, what a pearl love is, when things are going well. And we're more inclined to contract when things are not going so well. So here's the other promised insight. This one is from a Hasidic rabbi, Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. In the 19th century, he is said to have had some scholars visiting him. And he asked those scholars, where does God dwell? I wonder what you would say if he was here in front of you, this earnest, beautiful man. Well, the scholars said, God is everywhere, of course. And perhaps they quoted from the Psalms when they said, heaven and earth is filled with his glory. But the rabbi shook his head and said, God dwells wherever a woman or man lets him in. In other words, what we are talking about is something that is utterly dependent on relationship, on the relationship of giving and accepting in order that you can give and accept. That is what relationship is. And that is the nature of our being, to be in relationship through the medium of love. These are very, very profound teachings. In other words, God may be everywhere. Heaven and earth may be filled with God's glory. But what good will it do any of us if we don't allow at least the notion of love to come in? Such love, enduring love, love that is patient, kind, and does not dishonor, can dwell only where and when we let it in. In other words, it's asking us also to participate in these acts of love, to participate in our own well-being, to participate in our own healing, to participate in the healing of our world. We can't leave it to the cognitive mind, and nor can we leave it to God. Love bears all things. That's a tricky statement too, isn't it? Love bears all things. But let's turn it around. Can we bear all things in the presence of love? I know that very, very often I would look at circumstances in my own life, and I know this is true of some of you too, with whom I have had deep talks. And I would know that alone I could not bear it. I could not bear it. In fact, without some sense, some intuition at least, about the kind of love that we are being introduced to here, many of us could bear very little. And I think that's partly because we are made of love. It is our nature. We actually need it. It is the kind of oxygen of the spirit. It's the expression of spirit. It's also a reminder that we are infinitely resourced, even and perhaps especially at times when we feel that our resources would barely fill a thimble. During the last couple of weeks in my own personal life, I've had to make some very conscious efforts to bear what I would not have chosen. I've had to make very conscious efforts to look with some compassion at my own situation, for myself and also for all the millions and millions of people who are truly suffering in our world. And I want to use this as an example of what those teachers, the rabbi, Paul, the Buddhist teacher, all directing us to know how enriched we already are. So let me just describe the situation that a week ago last Friday, I went to Brisbane expecting to go to a wedding the following day, and a few hours later I was phoned by one of my neighbours to tell me that my house had been flooded. I felt so sorry for her actually having to share such news, and I must say that it took me ages to comprehend what she was saying. I could not grasp it. I had a terribly sleepless night, as you can imagine, and came back very, very early the following morning to Sydney, and already by then the insurance people had sent in what are called make-safe workmen, and they're angels, every one of them, because they immediately try to make your house as secure as it possibly can be. Now, the consequences of this flood are not easy, not pleasant. 2/3 of my house are affected. But the reason I'm bringing it to you is that the consequences have also been instructive. Much of my house is damaged, but none of my books. Much of my house is damaged, but my children, and especially my daughter with whom I'm staying, have been immensely supportive. Much of my house is damaged, but it can be repaired. Much of my house is damaged, but I am insured. Much of my house is damaged, but I do still have a house, unlike millions of our brothers and sisters in this world. And I'm also deeply aware, as I say this, that some of you are dealing with things where there are not buts. So just back to my own story. If I let love into this picture, then I am sustained. If I let outrage or rage or frustration or self-pity dominate my thinking, and of course I floated with all of them, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I? But if I let love into the situation, then I can begin to bear it. It is not a death. There is no loss of life. There is no loss of limb or mind or mental health or physical health. There is no loss of someone I love or cherish. Proportion reasserts itself, but not easily. Not easily. This is not a talk from Pollyanna. Not easily. This is to remind you that whenever something happens that shifts the axis of what we expected, we need to call, we need to surrender to something greater than ourselves, whether it is our belief in the kindness of other people or whether it is our belief in the love that I have been speaking about. I also noticed that in this crisis I needed to find new depths of patience, not just with people who may or may not be helping me, but most of all with myself. I needed to find patience with myself, because the crisis can feel very large, and I, or you perhaps, can feel very small and very inadequate. I wanted to make this really clear to you by finding a quote from a book that I have at home called The Gifts of Suffering by Polly Young Eisendrath. But when I went looking for it, I couldn't find this book. I know it's there, my books have not been damaged, I know it's there, and I thought it was like a little game that the universe was playing with me. Not that I think the universe sits down and thinks, what game will I play with Stephanie Dowrick today? On the contrary, but it was a little game. I couldn't find a book that I have looked at many times over the years, though perhaps not for some years, called The Gifts of Suffering. And I realized that I had to, like each one of us, identify the gifts of suffering for myself. Not to consult Polly, or even be inspired by her, but to find them for myself. So my sense is strong, and it's been strong for many years, that the most crucial gifts of suffering that we will learn is that there are gifts. But this is extremely painful to come at. Not in a situation like mine, where things can be repaired, but in a situation where they cannot be repaired. In that context, even to talk about the gifts of suffering can seem obscene. So let's be very, very cautious, particularly when we are identifying the gifts of suffering for other people. As I sat with this thought, I shifted from thinking about gifts to thinking about revelations. What is suffering, in this instance, revealing to me? It's revealing to me how suffering slows us down. I literally felt I was moving underwater. How ironic, given that my house was flooded. But as we're slowed down, we have to look more deeply. I think generally speaking, I move at a ridiculously fast pace. So suffering has slowed me down. Suffering also humbles us. We have to accept our limitations and sometimes step beyond them. So we have to redefine our limitations. Suffering also reveals to us the truth of our neediness. We can have all kinds of defenses against our needs and our neediness. And they are defenses, and they don't always serve us well. We have to accept help from other people, and we have to newly value the help that we are receiving and the trustworthiness of other people. A whole range of people, some of whom you know very well, and some of whom you are just meeting because of this situation. I also learned how suffering frightens us. It does. It frightens us. It offends every kind of delusion that we have about our own immortality, our own courage, our own strength. And in those moments, we must again and again and again and again, with patience, ask love to enter, so that we can be present to love, and love can be present to us. I also realized again how suffering wearies us. It literally exhausts us. It literally exhausts us. It wakes us up to the suffering that so many people are bearing. And in that, of course, it restores our sense of proportion. And not finally, because this is not an A to Z, it reminds us too of what still lives. So much still lives, so much continues even while we're held back. And at a certain point we'll rejoin or regain the normal impetus. I want to emphasize that I'm absolutely not a hero in this. I don't want you to look at me and think, oh God, how many books has she written and how many years has she spent doing her practices, and oh, it's all very well for her. On the contrary, I have had many, many exhausted and bewildered moments in this last week or so. And I also realized that this event would have been much worse if I hadn't had much worse in the past. If I hadn't had losses that can never be regained. It could have been experienced much worse. And that's almost the last point that I want to leave you with, because the revelations that come through suffering will always be specific to each one of us. There is not one size that fits all. So let's be very hesitant to judge or idealize anyone else's reaction to suffering. Let's be very, very cautious. Let's meet our suffering with mindfulness, but also with curiosity. You know, it takes great heart to be vulnerable. Sometimes it takes more heart to be vulnerable than it does to be strong. It takes great heart to ask for and receive help. It takes great heart to live lovingly. Yet, can we together trust that faith, hope, and love live now and forevermore, and that the greatest of these is love? Peace in your hearts, peace in our world.